Okay, so before we get started on the interesting stuff, I have some announcements to make about the exam. We'll have an exam, of course, on next Wednesday. It'll open at 1 o'clock after the lectures. What will be on that exam will be through Monday's lecture. So today's lecture, Friday's lecture, and Monday's lecture will be on the exam. Now, as you've probably heard, as we mentioned in class, we have to change the format. The format has to be changed because of an academic integrity problem on the last exam. Students are going out and finding sites where they could buy answers, and so that's got to end. So the only way we know how to approach this right now is to approach it by using some sort of a proctoring system. So we're going to use Respondus as the proctoring system. The exam will be proctored through Respondus, and you'll be able to access Respondus through Canvas. In the next day or two, we're going to put up a quiz, a kind of practice quiz that you can take through Respondus, just to make sure everything's working. You'll need to have a camera on your on your laptop, and you'll need to have a microphone. And so you'll need that information for Respondus. You may not need a microphone for this, do you? Don't know. All right. So we're all new to Respondus, and we'll see how this all falls out. The other point I want to make is that because it's now a proctored exam, it's not going to be open book, open note. So in order to compensate for that to some extent, what we'll allow you to do is you can take notes, write out your notes on a single sheet of paper, front and back. Then at the beginning of the exam, show that note to the camera, both sides, and then show that you've destroyed it at the end of the exam. And so we'll try to get some control over all of this as we go along. But the major thing here is you can have a full page of notes front and back. And so go ahead and take your notes. I think that you should be careful not to be too detailed on them, in that I think you should try to summarize concepts more than just have words on there that you've memorized. So let's take a shot at this and see how it goes. That's where we stand, and that will be for next Wednesday's exam. What we're going to do today is I'm going to finish the story that we had yesterday on the reflex arc, and we're going to emphasize the idea of the reflex arc being confined to the spinal cord. And that we're then going to talk about having pathways that will ascend and descend in the spinal cord. These ascending pathways will be sensory, and the descending pathways will be motor. There are lots of these. And if you take a neuroanatomy course, you'll understand the nuances of a number of these various pathways as they deliver information from the periphery into the spinal cord and then to different parts of the brain. But the one we're going to emphasize here is the so-called somatosensory pathways. The somatosensory pathways, as the name implies, are sensory information coming from the body. Somato meaning body, sensory of course meaning the sensory system. So we're going to be carrying information on primary sensory afferents into the central nervous system, much as we talked about yesterday. Yesterday. And what we'll do then is we're going to carry the information into the central nervous system on primary sensory afferents. That's this term here. Now, in the central nervous system now, we're going to follow the primary sensory afferents. And we're going to see that the primary sensory afferent is going to synapse onto a second-order neuron, and the second-order neuron is going to synapse onto a third-order neuron, and the third-order neuron is going to then synapse onto neurons in the somatosensory cortex. So we have this three-cell pathway, 1, 2, 3. And we'll always have this three-cell pathway, regardless of whether we're talking about the so-called spinal thalamic tract or whether we're talking about the so-called medial lemniscus sensory tract, the dorsal column medial lemniscus tract. So all of these will have three-cell pattern, 1 cell, 2 cell, 3 cell. Now, there are certain rules of this, and if you know the rules, it makes it much, much easier. And the rules are, first, primary sensory afferents never cross the midline. They always remain on the side of the body where their cell body resides. And during development, they have migrated out to have their cell bodies in those dorsal or posterior root ganglia. They then will send processes out into the periphery, receiving information in the periphery, and will transmit information via action potentials from the periphery back into the central nervous system. They never cross the midline. We're going to see this is true for all sensory modalities in the somatosensory system. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about fine touch and proprioception, or whether we're talking about pain or pressure or temperature. The primary sensory afferents always go out into the periphery and receive information in the periphery. Primary sensory afferents, as we set up here, will synapse onto second order neurons. The second order neurons are always in the central nervous system. The second order neurons will have processes that always cross the midline. So first order neurons never cross the midline, second order neurons always cross the midline, and the second order neurons always synapse onto third order neurons found in the thalamus. So that's 1, 2, 3. Primary sensory afferent, second order neuron, third order neuron. Primary sensory afferent comes in from the periphery, second order neuron crosses the midline, third order neuron. The third order neuron now has its cell body in the thalamus and sends a process into the somatosensory cortex. That's going to be true for both these pathways we're going to talk about. And over here we'll begin talking about the different pathways. So the two pathways we're going to talk about are the so-called DCML or PCML, the dorsal column medial lemniscal, sometimes known as the posterior column medial lemniscal pathway, and the other one is called the spinothalamic tract. Where we see differences between, now we just went through all of the similarities, where we see differences, and the major difference really is in the second order neurons. The second order neurons of the DCML and PCML, which we're going to see, are carrying information about fine touch, discriminative touch, and proprioception. The proprioception coming from the stretch receptors we talked about for the stretch receptor reflex arc yesterday. These neurons in the DCML, PCML, these neurons cross over in the brainstem. So we said that the second order neurons always cross over. The distinction between the DCML and the spinothalamic tract is where these neurons cross the midline. The neurons cross the midline in the brainstem for the PCML, DCML. The second order neurons of the spinothalamic tract, which are carrying information about pain and pressure and temperature, these guys cross over in the spinal cord. In fact, the second order neurons have their cell bodies in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, are synapsed onto almost immediately after the primary sensory afferents enter the dorsal horn and receive their synaptic inputs from the primary sensory afferents in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. These neurons then cross over the midline and then ascend the cord in something known as the spinothalamic tract. They ascend the cord in the spinothalamic tract, and the second order neurons then form synapses onto the third order neurons located in the thalamus. Now, note that terminology. This is an important terminology in neuroanatomy, and it almost always has an exam question based on this. The spinothalamic tract tells you where the neuronal cell body is for this tract, and it tells you where the output region is for that tract, for the neurons in that tract. So when I say spinothalamic, immediately you think the neuronal cell body for that tract is in the spinal cord, spino. And its output region is in the thalamus, spinothalamic. So the spinothalamic tells you the neuronal cell body is in the spinal cord, its output region is in the thalamus. So input region is in the spinal cord, output region is in the thalamus, spinothalamic. And that nomenclature is true for all manner of tracts. Remember, we said tracts yesterday are in the central nervous system, bundles of axons, but they're carrying information from an input region of a neuron to an output region of a neuron. So we can name them in terms of where the cell body is, the input region, and where the output region is. We're going to see that the spinothalamic tract, as the name implies, has its synapses in the thalamus. So the second order neurons will form synapses onto the neurons in the thalamus. The thalamus is a relay center. The thalamus is a relay site where all information, all sensory information, except for olfaction, comes into the thalamus and forms synapses in the thalamus before being passed on to the cortex, into the cerebrum. So we'll find here that this information is going to the somatosensory cortex. The somatosensory cortex is a region of the brain, a region of the cerebrum called the postcentral gyrus. So these third-order neurons, whose cell bodies are in the thalamus, extend processes into the postcentral gyrus where they form synapses. And one of the characteristics of the postcentral gyrus, in addition to being the somatosensory cortex, is that there's a body plan mapped out onto the surface of the somatosensory cortex, and we'll talk about that. That there are particular regions of the body in the somatosensory cortex. There are particular regions of the body that send their information to particular regions in the somatosensory cortex, and we'll walk our way through that. When we get to this point, we're going to have ended the input region, the ascending pathways, and then we're going to talk about descending pathways. There just isn't time in here to go through all of the exquisite pathways that lie between the somatosensory system and the motor system. It's an exquisite system, but we just don't have time to get into it. So we're going to magically take the information to the somatosensory system over to the motor system, and then descending pathways in the spinal cord. We're going to see these descending pathways begin with the motor cortex. The motor cortex is a region of the cerebrum called the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus is characterized by having upper motor neurons. The upper motor neurons are located in a particular layer. They're in layer 4. I'll never hold you to that. But these upper motor neurons located in the motor cortex send processes out from the motor cortex. Those processes, those axons, this will be one great long axon. The axon then enters the internal capsule. Now, for our purposes here, we're going to talk about the internal capsule as being entirely motor. If you take a neuroanatomy course, you'll find the internal capsule includes myelinated axons of third-order neurons as they ascend to the somatosensory cortex. We're going to divide this. We're going to say basically that we're going to say the internal capsule is all motor. Hold on to that idea when you get to a neuroanatomy course and recognize that I'm lying to you a bit here. But the internal capsule for our purposes here today contains the axons of the upper motor neurons. And if we follow these axons, they're contained in the internal capsule. They skirt round the thalamus. They then come down into the brainstem, and just before the brainstem fuses with the spinal cord, those upper motor neurons cross over the midline in a place called the decussation of the pyramids. When they cross over the midline in the decussation of the pyramids, then these axons continue to descend the cord, but now they're descending the cord on the opposite side of where they originated. That's the idea of decussation. Decussation comes out of the Latin. It means to cross over. Now, once we're in the spinal cord, we can have the tract we can talk about. Now, this tract is the lateral corticospinal tract, and it's referred to as the lateral corticospinal tract because in the spinal cord, these axons, these conductal regions in the lateral corticospinal tract have their cell bodies, have their input regions in the cortex. These are the upper motor neurons. The upper motor neurons in the lateral corticospinal tract, they then will, just at the right moment, if they're going to innervate cells of, say, the hand, they'll leave the corticospinal tract and then form synapses in the ventral horn, the anterior horn of the spinal cord, and they'll have a synapse onto the lower motor neuron. So this is a monosynaptic pathway of the upper motor neuron onto the lower motor neuron, going from the precentral gyrus all the way down into the spinal cord. So let me take you through some slides here. I'll quickly walk through some slides to summarize where we were yesterday and try to tie together what we talked about yesterday with the reflex arcs, with the concepts of ascending pathways that we're going to delve into today. The first slide is showing the pathway we talked about yesterday. This is a summary of what we dealt with yesterday. Out here, this is meant to represent the input region of that stretch receptor neuron. This is the input region of the stretch receptor neuron. It's embedded in the muscle. And from our story yesterday, this is embedded in the quadriceps muscle. When the quadriceps muscle is stretched, we open channels here in this input region of this primary sensory afferent. That generates, these stretch-activated channels generate a graded potential. The more of these channels we open, the stronger the stretch, the larger the graded potential. If the graded potential, if the amplitude of the graded potential exceeds threshold at the trigger zone, then an action potential, or series of action potentials most likely, are being fired and propagating along the axon, all along this conductal region, over the neuronal cell body in the posterior root ganglion, and then terminating here on the lower motor neuron in the ventral horn. One long pathway, one long conductal pathway releasing glutamate onto the motor neuron, activating EPSPs in the lower motor neuron. If these then summate at the trigger zone and fire an action potential in the lower motor neuron, that's shown here. Action potentials propagating along the axon to release acetylcholine onto the muscle fiber to tell the muscle fiber to contract, initially through an excitatory postsynaptic potential and then through an action potential that's generated by adding together these EPSPs. So that's the pathway, the electrical signals in that reflex pathway. And this is the anatomy of the pathway. This is the quadriceps muscle. This is the patella. This is the patellar tendon. They're showing here how we can stretch the patellar tendon when we strike it. We pull on the patellar tendon. When we pull on the patellar tendon, that pulls on the quadriceps muscle. When we pull on the quadriceps muscle, we generate generator potentials here in the input region of the primary sensory afferent. It generates action potentials to propagate along the conductal region down into the gray matter of the spinal cord, and here the primary sensory afferent synapses directly onto the lower motor, and just as we showed in the previous slide, the release of glutamate here causes EPSPs, they summate to make an action potential. Action potentials then propagate to the muscle where they release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, causing this muscle to contract. In the last bits of the discussion yesterday, we talked about this synapse. Here we have the primary sensory afferent, the same primary sensory afferent that synapses onto this lower motor neuron that innervates the quadricep. This primary sensory afferent now innervates an inhibitory interneuron. Again, we release glutamate. It generates EPSPs. The EPSPs summate, provide action potentials, propagate to the axon terminal, the output region of the interneuron, and now at this point release inhibitory neurotransmitter. The inhibitory neurotransmitter opens chloride channels here in the lower motor neuron to inhibit the probability of this neuron, this purple neuron, this lavender neuron, to inhibit this neuron so it doesn't fire action potentials and simultaneously activate the quadriceps and the hamstring. So this is the hamstring. This is the motor neuron to the hamstring. Now you'll notice there's no direct inhibition of the muscle here in this system. All the inhibition occurs back here in the central nervous system, where we use this inhibitory interneuron to release inhibitory neurotransmitters to inhibit this lower motor neuron innervating the hamstring muscle. And this is called reciprocal inhibition. All of these muscles have this reciprocal inhibition. If you could pull on the stretch receptors for the hamstring, you could run this thing the other way. And there will be an inhibition of the motor neuron going to the quadriceps. So, any questions up to that? Okay, so the no questions, here's where we're headed now. This image shows the neuronal cell body of the primary sensory afferent located in the dorsal or posterior root ganglion, sending the process into the central nervous system and forming synapses in the ventral horn. But in addition, this neuron, this very same neuron, is going to send a process that now is ascending the cord. And this is what we're going to follow today. We're going to follow the pathway of this primary sensory afferent as it enters this set of conductal regions, this tract called the dorsal columns. And we're going to follow it as it goes to the central nervous system. Now, to help orient you here, this is another another cross-section through the spinal cord. This is what we drew yesterday. Now this is going to drill down a little bit farther. What we emphasized yesterday was this gray matter, the butterfly. And we said that this is all input regions, or mostly input regions of neurons. We said that the primary sensory afferent would send a process in and come all the way down here into the ventral horn and synapse onto the lower motor neuron. Today what we'll see is that very same neuron, the very same primary sensory afferent that sends a process down here in the ventral horn, has another branch, and that branch enters this structure called the dorsal column system. In blue here we have the dorsal column system. This dorsal column system are the tracts of something known as the dorsal column or posterior column medial lemniscal pathway. So we're going to see these are heavily myelinated axons, heavily myelinated conductile regions of primary sensory afferents that have entered the spinal cord. Down here is another pathway, and this is blithely referred to as the ventromedial pathway. But in fact, the one part that we are going to talk about is the spinothalamic tract. This is going to have axons whose neuronal cell bodies originate on the opposite side of the cord in the dorsal horn, send their process across, enter this spinothalamic tract, and now ascend the cord to the thalamus. And we're going to talk about these two paths and compare their anatomy. So the first way we're going to do this, we're going to walk through it on the board, and I'll try to tell you where all of these neuronal cell bodies are and what they're doing. So let's draw the spinal cord right here. There's the spinal cord. There's the gray matter. Now in blue, out here in the periphery, because remember this is the dorsal root and then the dorsal or posterior root ganglion, there's the neuronal cell body, sends a process in. The emphasis yesterday was how that process would go into the ventral horn. Today's emphasis is how a branch, a process, an extension of this very same neuron here in the spinal cord, once it enters the spinal cord, now will enter this structure here. Again, let me draw this out and try to reorient you with a kind of crosshairs. Where everything above the line is posterior or dorsal. Everything below the midline is ventral or anterior. And then the way we're going to do this is as though my feet were on the table and I'm into the board. So this is going to be right. This is going to be left. And then this vertical dotted line is meant to represent the midline. So this neuron, this primary sensory afferent can be carrying, this is a primary sensory afferent. And this primary sensory afferent is going to be carrying information. It's going to be carrying sensory information about proprioception. Proprioception is a remarkable sense that we all have. Most of us have. There are very, very few people who don't have it. Proprioception tells us where a body is in space. The inputs for proprioception are coming from all manner of stretch receptors. Some of them are embedded in the muscle, some of them are in tendons, and we constantly have information coming in from this proprioception input to tell us where we are in space. And it's the reason here that I can close my eyes and touch my nose. I can do that because I know where my hand is in space, I know where my nose is in space, and without even seeing it, I can touch my nose. That's the concept of proprioception. It's coming all the time from these sensory inputs that tell us where our body is in space. This is a remarkable system. In addition to proprioception, there's something known as fine or discriminative touch. Again, we're remarkably good at this, and the example I like to use is you've been out one night and you get home and it's late and you realize that you've forgotten and put your keys in your backpack. And so now you have to get into the house, but the lights are off, and the only way you're going to find your keys is to fish through your backpack and find them by touch. So you fish through the backpack wishing you didn't have so much junk in there, and you finally find your keys, and you work your way through each of the keys, and then you find the key that's to the house. You separate it out from your car key, you separate it out from your bicycle key, you separate it out from any number of other keys, and you say, oh, that's the house key, all by touch. Find the lock by touch and insert that key into the lock, simply by doing it by touch, not seeing any of it. Flip the lock open, walk into the house. That's all done by this proprioception and fine touch. It's going to be carried on this pathway called the posterior or dorsal medial lemniscal pathway. Now, one of the things I want you to recognize is that we are bilaterally symmetrical. So as I talk about this primary sensory afferent on the right side, recognize there's another one on the left. It's a neuron that comes into the cord, does the same thing on the left side as we saw yesterday on the right. And now this neuron, very same neuron, sends a branch and goes again into this region up here, which is the dorsal or posterior column medial lemniscal pathway. So we're now in this bundle of axons, this tract in the central nervous system. Well, let's go over to the right-hand panel since I don't have quite enough room here, and I'll try to draw this now in a slightly different fashion. So where we see on the center panel, we're looking at the cross-section of the spinal cord. What we're going to do here is we're going to show a longitudinal. Now where on the middle panel you can imagine my head being into the board and my feet being out into the room, here we're going to draw it, and sometimes this gets known as the ice cream cone diagram. You'll see why in a moment. Where this is the brainstem. So this brainstem is going to be above your first cervical vertebrae. It's going to be encased in the skull. And then if we look at the spinal cord, and I won't show all of these, of course, but there are pairs of spinal nerves. So each one of these lines coming out of the spinal cord is meant to represent a pair of spinal nerves. Turns out there are 31 pairs. I'm not going to show all of them. The one I want to think about, though, is the one we talked about yesterday. And here's the leg. Again, this is going to be right. This is going to be left. Here's the quadriceps muscle. Here's the input region of that primary sensory afferent. Cell body out here in the dorsal root ganglion, or posterior root ganglion, process comes into the cord. Now what we're going to be interested in here is its process in the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway. Where in cross-section, we simply show this axon coming into the dorsal columns. Here we're going to follow this neuron all the way up the cord. Let's go all the way up the cord to here. And here in orange, find a site called the dorsal or posterior column nuclei. Now again, you'll remember nuclei as a cluster of neuronal cell bodies in the central nervous system. We're in the central nervous system, after all, we're in the brainstem. And so we're going to see here that we have a cluster of input regions in these dorsal column nuclei. Well, these input regions here, I'll show them as little dots. This is meant to be the input or cell body region. Of the second order neuron. Remember, I said this whole story is going to be counting 1, 2, 3. So here's 1, primary sensory afferent, synapsing onto the second order neuron. So it's 2. And we said that the rule is always, always, always primary sensory afferent does not cross the midline, so it's on the same side. But now it crosses over the midline. The second order neuron crosses over the midline, and A sends the cord to a region I'll show in red. A sends the brainstem, actually, to a region I'll show here in red, called the thalamus. Now, the story we're telling here today is that all this sensory information coming in from the body, all the somatosensory information, is going to be carried on primary sensory afferents synapse onto second order neurons that cross the midline. But we're also going to find that the second order neurons always, always, always form synapses in the thalamus. And that's true not only for the somatosensory system, but if you take another course, you'll find it's also true for the auditory system and the visual system. In fact, for all sensory systems except for smell, all of those systems will have synapses in the thalamus. So this is no exception. So here's the output region. We show the output region as a Y. And here in the thalamus, it synapses onto this red neuron. And this red neuron then sends a process to the next relay station, which is in fact, I'm going to show you this is a kind of oval. And this is meant to represent the somatosensory cortex in the cerebrum. So in red, we have this third order neuron. Now sends a process out and synapses onto neurons here in layer 5 of the somatosensory cortex. So that's the pathway, 1, 2, 3. Primary sensory afferent, second order neuron crosses the midline, synapses in the thalamus, this neuron sends processes to the somatosensory cortex and forms synapses there. So that's the pathway to the brain. Now we can do this on the other side, and I'm regretting I didn't leave myself a little more room over here. So if we now think about the other side here, truncated leg, and the quadriceps muscle, and the input region for that somatosensory neuron has this neuronal cell body here in the posterior or dorsal root ganglion, sends the process into the central nervous system, joins the posterior or dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, and A sends the cord all the way up to the brainstem. In the brainstem again, we see the same pattern as we saw on the other side. This again is the dorsal column nuclei. So this is meant to be the dorsal, I'll abbreviate it here, dorsal column nuclei. So the primary sensory afferent now will synapse onto the second order neuron, and the same pattern applies. The second order neuron now crosses over the midline and ascends the brainstem up to the thalamus. And in the thalamus, again, we synapse onto a third order neuron. Now I should spell this out because I've been blithely talking about it. We're talking about, over here, the dorsal or posterior column. And these are the columns. Back here on the cross section, here are the columns. We're simply showing those columns in longitudinal section here and here. So this is the dorsal column, medial, lemniscal pathway. The so-called dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway is this entire pathway, including the primary sensory afferent, the second order neuron, and then the third order neuron to the somatosensory system up in the cerebrum. That's the whole pathway. It's the dorsal column system. One more point I should make here is that this is the midline. And what we see on the right-hand side, we see on the left-hand side. And so that bilateral symmetry extends all the way into the cerebrum. And then in this particular case, this third order neuron now is going to have a process that goes into the cerebrum and forms synapses. So you'll see what we have here is a bilaterally symmetrical pathway. Primary afferents here on the opposite side will then innervate parts of the brain on the other side of the body. And that's all because that crossing over is all because of the second order neurons crossing the midline. Now we have done this for the dorsal column system, and I'll emphasize here that that dorsal column system, again, this is carrying information about proprioception, and fine touch. But now we're going to go back to the cross section, and we're going to talk about another pathway. And here we're going to talk about a pathway called the spinothalamic pathway. We can set the pattern up again, just as we did on the right-hand board. Where the primary sensory afferent is carrying information about proprioception and fine touch. So this is this neuron. It's embedded in the muscle. Now it could be any number of, a whole bunch of different sensory neurons, some of which may be to Golgi tendon organs, they may be to a number of stretch to proprioceptive sites. But for our purposes here, since we told the story yesterday from the point of view of the quadriceps, we can tell again from the point of view of the stretch receptor neuron in the quadriceps. And just as we saw in our ice cream cone diagram, we have a symmetrical arrangement here. So again, we're bilaterally symmetrical, right and left. On the left side, this is for the left leg. This is that's the quadriceps muscle. And here's the cell body, enters the dorsal column system. Now what we want to talk about, though, is another set of neurons. We'll have a neuron down here. I'm going to put this one on your toe. And this neuron is going to be a pain-sensitive neuron. So in this case, you can now imagine you've gotten up in the middle of the night, walking across the room, and you've left something in the middle of the room you wish you hadn't, and you walk into it and you stub your toe and it hurts. So that's going to set up a generator potential for the pain, set up action potentials that are going to be propagated along this neuron. Again, it's a primary sensory afferent, so it's going to have its neuronal cell body here and the posterior dorsal root ganglion. It's going to send a process into the central nervous system. And now almost immediately after entering the central nervous system, it's going to synapse onto a second order neuron. To maintain our convention, I'll leave the second order neuron in orange. The second order neuron then sends a process that crosses the midline through the gray matter and finds its way over here to a site called the spinothalamic tract. So again, in the spinothalamic tract, we have neurons. We have second order neurons. So the process of the second order neuron crosses the midline, receives its input in the dorsal horn, crosses over the midline, and enters the spinothalamic tract. We can do the same thing on the other side. This is a pain-sensitive neuron. Could be temperature, could be pressure. It sends a process now. Primary sensory afferent, so it has its neuronal cell body in the dorsal or posterior root ganglion. That process then extends into the spinal cord. But again, we'll see this neuron synapses directly onto a second order neuron. The input region of the second order neuron here is now found in the dorsal horn. This process now sends a process across the midline and over here again enters this structure that is known as the spinothalamic tract. So now let's go to the other panel. Let's come back over here and let's do the same thing. So we've drawn this out in cross section, but now let's imagine down here at the tip of your toe, I'll do it here first, there is a sensory neuron. Again, it has its neuronal cell body here in the posterior root ganglion, sends a process into the spinal cord, but now almost immediately after entering the spinal cord, it synapses onto a second order neuron. And the second order neuron now crosses the midline and ascends the cord on the opposite side, finding its way up here, just as the other one did, to a site known as the thalamic relay nucleus. It now synapses onto that third order neuron that sends a process to the somatosensory cortex. If we follow the process from the other side, here's the pain neuron. Neuronal cell body in the posterior root ganglion synapse process into the spinal cord. In the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, the synapses onto the second order neuron. Second order neuron crosses the midline, ascends the cord all the way up here to form a synapse in the thalamic relay nucleus. Now, in the thalamic relay nucleus, the second order neuron synapses onto a third order neuron, sends a process out to the somatosensory cortex. Now, one thing I want to emphasize here, after drawing all of these pathways on the board, is that yesterday, when we were talking about the reflex arc, that was entirely intrinsic to the spinal cord itself. But in fact, if we cut the cord, we're going to fail to deliver information to the brain. And so if we cut the cord, if we damage the cord, then this information can't ascend the cord and get to the brain, and therefore cannot give you sensation. So if you cut the cord, you can't feel what's going on in your legs, but in fact, you'll still have reflexes. So now let me walk you through something, and this is something called Brown-Séquard spell it out better. It's called Brown-Séquard syndrome. Brown-Séquard syndrome is something that happens all too often. And what happens is that there's damage to the spinal cord that only goes to the midline. Why I want to tell you about Brown-Séquard syndrome is not so much because of the syndrome. Why I want to tell you about it is that if you can follow what this lesion is doing, you understand the somatosensory system. So what I'm going to do is, in this diagram, I'm going to imagine that there was an accident. And in the accident, we have cut the cord right to the midline on the right side. So this is basically a cut. As long as the cell bodies for these primary sensory afferents and the cell bodies for the lower motor neurons remain intact, we'll still get a complete reflex. So the reflex will be intact. But what's happening, though, is this information now is not being delivered to the brain. And so certain pieces of information are now lacking, and the person has some sensation, but not others. And let's walk through it. What's going to get through and what's blocked? So if we cut the cord to this point, what happens to information about proprioception and fine touch from the same side of the body? Well, it's cut, it's broken. We've broken that. But how about information about pain? How about if we pinch this person down here? We'll find that even though we've cut the cord on this side, that pain information gets through and the person can feel pain. It's true for pressure and temperature, because we know the pressure, temperature, and pain are carried on this spinothalamic tract, and it's still intact because we cut the cord up here. But the synapse between the primary sensory afferent and the second order neuron and the processes of the second order neuron remain intact. If we look at the other side, we see that information about fine touch and proprioception, it gets through just fine. It's not cut, it's not interrupted. But in fact, because we've cut the second order neurons here on the opposite side of the cord, we have now interrupted information about pain, crude touch, and temperature from arriving at the thalamic relay site and then on to the somatosensory cortex. So basically, if you can follow it through, if you can puzzle your way through that and understand why some information gets through and others don't, then you understand the layout of this plan. The other reason I like to talk about this is that neurologists who are constantly, and neurosurgeons who are constantly dealing with things that are broken in the nervous system are typically outstanding anatomists. And the reason they're such outstanding anatomists is that they need that anatomical information to diagnose where things are broken. And this is a classic case of where you can diagnose where the problems are broken because you'll be able to see what gets through and what doesn't, and knowing the pathways that one pathway crosses over and the other doesn't will tell you a lot of information, give you a lot of information about where the system is broken. Let me introduce this next one, and I'll do it really, really quickly, and then we'll come back to this and I'll finish this story tomorrow. Real quick, we'll emphasize this a little later, but what I want to show you real quickly here is that this is basically the cerebrum. This is the cerebellum down here. It's as though I'm standing here facing this wall and we're looking at the left-hand side of my brain. This is all cerebrum. The cerebrum is divided into these different regions. This is the frontal lobe. This is underneath the frontal bone. This is the parietal lobe. It's under the parietal bone. There's occipital lobe under the occipital bone. This is the temporal region under the temporal bone. These are named for the bones of the skull under which they sit. What we're looking at here is millions and millions and millions of cells, but what we're interested in right now is how they're organized. What they've shown here is they've cut out a little wedge, and what they're trying to emphasize is that in cutting out this wedge, what we're looking at is a very thin veneer on the outside of the cerebrum. This is called the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex has 6 neuronal cell body layers, and that cerebral cortex is a very, very thin veneer, very, very thin series of cells on the surface of the brain. Everything below that is white matter. So all the gray matter is where synaptic integration is going on, but the rest of the brain are these complicated interconnections of axons, conductor regions, interconnecting different parts of the brain. What we're interested in here is the cortex, and particularly the region we're interested in of the cortex is this region called the postcentral gyrus. It's named because there's this great infolding here called the central sulcus, sometimes known as the central fissure, and this now is the postcentral gyrus. That's where we find the sensory, somatosensory cortex, and we'll talk about tomorrow, is how those third-order neurons send processes into this region of the cerebrum and form synapses in a particular fashion called somatotopy. And we'll start tomorrow with the ideas of somatotopy.